To speak of the Columbine massacre is to confront a web of complexity. The censorship across various media platforms, the deep-rooted problem of school bullying, the debate over school safety, the fierce controversy surrounding gun control in the United States, a critique of American society itself, and the chilling influence this particular shooting has had on similar cases. These are but a few of the inflection points tied to a tragedy that shook the entire world. Its consequences still rippling through the present day. The questions seem endless, the answers profoundly unsatisfactory. While it was not the first mass shooting in a school, nor the deadliest, it was one of the most mediatic and transcendent of the last several decades. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, the perpetrators of the slaughter, became the infamous faces of a phenomenon that is no longer exclusive to the United States, but has spread in an alarming fashion. It was exactly 11:19 in the morning, on Tuesday, April 20th, 1999, at Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado. Morning classes had just ended, and some 480 students were gathered in the school cafeteria, while others wandered the grounds on what seemed to be a day like any other. Richard Castaldo and Rachel Scott, both 17, were sitting on the grass near the west entrance, lost in conversation. They saw two boys in long black trench coats approaching from the parking lot, but paid them little mind until one of them threw an object that exploded nearby. Castaldo would later recall that the blast wasn't very powerful. He thought it was just a firecracker. But then, in a sudden, horrifying shift, the young men pulled firearms from beneath their coats and began shooting at them. Rachel Scott was hit 4 times, one bullet to the head, causing her instant death. Richard Castaldo was struck 8 times in the chest, abdomen, and arm. Though he managed to survive, 2 of his vertebrae were destroyed. He would never walk again. Alerted by the gunfire, the other students outside began to flee in terror as the killers opened fire indiscriminately. 3 more teenagers were cut down on the building's steps just a few feet from the first attack. Sean Graves, 15, and Lance Kirkland, 16, were gravely wounded, while Daniel Rohrbaugh died moments later from a gunshot to the chest. Michael Johnson, 15, was shot in the face, arm, and leg. Mark Taylor, 16, was hit in the chest, arms, and one of his legs. Anne-Marie Hochhalter, 17, suffered multiple gunshots to her chest and back, which would leave her paralyzed. Lance Kirkland, already hit by the first volley, received an execution-style shot to the face from one of the attackers, yet somehow he survived. As chaos consumed the west entrance, with dozens of people running for their lives, those inside the school began to hear the screams and gunshots. Teachers and students called 911. Others, curious, peered through windows to see what was happening. Patty Nielsen, a 35-year-old teacher in the hallway, headed toward the west entrance, drawn by the commotion. As she reached the main door, the glass shattered from a shotgun blast, and a shard of shrapnel wounded her shoulder. She managed to take refuge just before the 2 assailants entered the building, intent on continuing their rampage. After opening fire with shotguns, semi-automatic pistols, and carbines, the shooters began hurling explosive devices, though few of them detonated. The ones that did, however, triggered the school's fire alarms and sprinkler systems, plunging the situation into even greater chaos. Hundreds of people were still trapped inside, locked down and hidden in various classrooms, unsure of where the explosions were coming from. Neil Gardner, a police officer assigned to the school as a security liaison, was alerted by radio, though he was unaware of the attack's magnitude. He arrived at the west entrance around 11:25 a.m. and exchanged fire with the shooters, who were now firing barrages of bullets through the windows. At that moment, the cafeteria held hundreds of students who had taken cover under tables following the instructions of William Dave Sanders, a 47-year-old teacher. When Sanders heard the first shots, he understood something terrible was happening. He ran into the hallway to investigate and confirmed it was a shooting. As security camera footage shows, he rushed the students out of the cafeteria, an act that would save countless lives. Sanders then ran back through the hallways to help other students, but came face to face with the attackers. One of them shot him, wounding him in the neck and shoulders. He was carried by another teacher to a classroom where several students were hiding. Though Sanders was conscious, he was bleeding profusely. A student administered first aid, but his condition remained critical. On a whiteboard, the students wrote the phrase "one bleeding to death" and placed it in a window facing outside, a desperate plea for help. The dramatic image would later be captured by news media around the world. Minutes after the shooting began, 6 police vehicles arrived and cordoned off the area, but officers were not authorized to enter the building until the situation was clear. The first reports were contradictory. Initially, there was talk of a sniper on a roof, then of a group of up to 8 armed individuals. All survivors were escorted out with their hands on their heads and thoroughly searched, as it was unknown if any of them might be involved. Some students claimed the shooters were 2 of their own, identifying them as Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, aged 18 and 17 respectively. They also said at least one was wearing a long black trench coat. Still, officers could not corroborate these statements. They didn't know the number of dead and wounded or if there was a hostage situation. At 11:29 a.m., the 2 gunmen entered the library where 52 students, 2 librarians, and 2 teachers were hiding under tables. One of them was Patty Nielsen, who had already encountered them at the west entrance. She was on the phone with a 911 operator when one of the attackers ordered everyone wearing a white hat to stand up. At Columbine, a group of students, often athletes and considered popular, were known for wearing white baseball caps. Despite the threat, no one emerged from their hiding spot, and so the gunman opened fire. The first to die in the library was Kyle Velasquez, 16, shot in the back and head. The shooters began reloading to continue the massacre when they noticed police outside evacuating other students. They turned their guns to the windows, firing with the intent to kill an officer. An intense exchange of fire followed, but no one outside was hit. After the shootout with police, they resumed their assault on the students inside the library. The other fatalities were Stephen Curnow, 14, killed by a shot to the neck; Cassie Bernal, 17, who received a shotgun blast to the head; Isaiah Schulz, 18, murdered with a shot to the chest, as was Matthew Kechter, 16. Lauren Townsend, 18, died from multiple gunshots. John Tomlin, 16, received several shots to the neck and head. Kelly Fleming, 16, was killed by a shotgun blast to the back. Daniel Mauser, 15, was murdered with a shot to the face, and Corey DePuter, 17, died after being shot in the neck and chest. Another 12 students were seriously wounded. The terrible ordeal was captured in the audio of Patty Nielsen's 911 call, a harrowing record of her pleas for help as she whispered to the operator, hiding with her students under the tables. By noon, nearly 1,000 police officers, several ambulances, armed forces teams, bomb squads, and a SWAT team surrounded Columbine High School, along with hundreds of reporters, photographers, and cameramen. The news was being broadcast live across the country. Still, special forces had not yet been authorized to enter the building. Gunshots and explosions could still be heard from inside, and groups of students who had been sheltering in classrooms would periodically emerge, further complicating rescue efforts. According to the official timeline of the massacre, at 12:02 p.m., Patty Nielsen, hiding in an adjacent room, heard the attackers re-enter the library and once again opened fire from the windows at the police. At 12:08 p.m., after a brief silence, she heard the young men shout in unison, "1, 2, 3," followed by two loud, nearly simultaneous blasts. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold had taken their own lives. An hour later, a SWAT team finally entered the school through a first-floor window. Some areas were flooded, the fire sprinklers and alarms still active. They moved slowly, clearing rooms one by one, evacuating the last survivors. The process was agonizingly slow, mainly because they didn't know if the attackers were still alive. Tragically, Dave Sanders, the teacher who had been shot at the start of the rampage after evacuating the cafeteria, would bleed to death in the classroom where he lay nearly 2 hours after his killers had committed suicide. At 2:38 p.m., from a window in the library, one of the epicenters of the shooting, a 17-year-old boy named Patrick Ireland appeared, pleading for help. A SWAT team approached in an armored vehicle and the boy threw himself from the window, his blood splattering the building's exterior. He had been shot twice in the head and once in the leg. Half of his body was paralyzed and he had been unconscious for over 2 hours, but he had miraculously survived. At 3:22 p.m., teacher Patty Nielsen and a pair of librarians were rescued. 8 minutes later, at 3:30 p.m., the SWAT team entered the library, discovering 12 bodies, including those of the two shooters. 18-year-old Eric Harris had taken his own life with a gunshot to the mouth, while 17-year-old Dylan Klebold had shot himself in the temple. Neither body was wearing a black trench coat, as several witnesses had claimed, though they had removed them during the course of the shooting. Amidst the devastation, an 18-year-old girl identified as Lisa Kreutz was found still alive, though suffering from multiple gunshot wounds. She was immediately rushed to a medical facility. The scale of the attack on Columbine High School was clearly catastrophic. Official figures were not released initially, and speculation ran rampant, with some reports suggesting as many as 25 dead and dozens injured. Authorities refused to provide data to the media until all preliminary investigations were complete. Meanwhile, the survivors of the massacre were taken to a nearby school to be reunited with their parents. Between tears, they shared their harrowing testimonies with journalists. One of the girls who managed to escape the library recalled having a gun pointed in her face and being threatened with death, just before another student beside her was murdered. She also said the two attackers had taunted an African-American student with racist slurs before executing him with a shot to the chest. The following day, it was confirmed that 14 students, including the two attackers and one teacher, had died. There were also 24 injured, 5 of whom remained in critical condition. The names Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold were quickly leaked, and their photographs began to appear on every news broadcast. The true scope of the Columbine massacre was not yet known when the first questions began to surface. How had two teenagers acquired such an arsenal? It was learned that during the attack, Harris had used a 9mm high-point carbine and a Savage Springfield shotgun, while Klebold used a double-barreled Stevens 311D shotgun and a semi-automatic Tech-9. The perpetrators were also carrying 99 pipe bombs, Molotov cocktails, and 2 duffel bags with propane explosives, which they had left in the cafeteria shortly before the shooting. Fortunately, despite being on timers, these larger bombs failed to detonate. Had they exploded, the number of victims would have been far greater. That morning, the young men had driven to school in their separate cars, and several more undetonated bombs were found inside both vehicles. Various bladed weapons which went unused were also found concealed in their clothing. It was evident that an attack of this magnitude had been planned long in advance. The question was, why? Eric David Harris was born on April 9, 1981, in Wichita, Kansas. He had an older brother and belonged to a stable, well-established family. His mother was Catherine Ann Poole, and his father, Wayne Harris, was an Air Force pilot. The Harris family moved several times due to the demanding schedule of a transport pilot. From a young age, Eric was considered an excellent student by his teachers. He didn't have many friends but seemed to be a self-assured young man. Despite earning top grades, he had some conflicts with his father, mainly because he wasn't applying himself. The Harris family moved to Littleton, Colorado in July 1993. That same year, he would meet Dylan Klebold, with whom he immediately struck up a friendship. They both entered Columbine High School 2 years later in 1995. As he entered his teenage years, Eric became interested in computers. He created a website where he wrote about his musical tastes and even designed his own levels for the famous video game Doom, one of the most popular and controversial titles of the 1990s. Doom is a first-person shooter that caused significant controversy at the time for its violence and satanic undertones. Eric was an enthusiast of video games in general, but he was drawn to Doom precisely for its content. The game was revolutionary from several perspectives. It was bloody, graphically appealing, had a huge online community, and allowed users to create and publish their own combat arenas. Under the aliases Reb Doomer, Reb, and Rebeldom Eric dedicated himself to programming several levels for the game, which he shared on blogs, forums, and related websites. His friend Dylan joined the online games under the pseudonym Vodiki, and Eric would include him in the acknowledgments every time he uploaded new content. Eric's first real problems began when he decided to expose his more private interests and feelings. On his website titled "You Know What I Hate," he declared his contempt for people in general, as well as for his schoolmates. In addition to his harsh criticisms of the U.S. education system, he published manuals on how to build homemade explosives, a definitive early warning of what was to come. He even had a hit list of people he wanted to eliminate. In 1997, through his website, he made a death threat against a neighbor his own age named Brooks Brown. Brooks had been his friend, but the two had a falling out after Eric smashed Brooks's car windshield with a piece of ice. Angry that Brooks was often late when picking him up for school. When Brooks told his parents, Eric wrote in an online post that he would kill him. Upon learning of the threat, ironically because Dylan told them, Brooks's parents went to the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office and filed a report, but nothing more came of it. Eric's father found his son's behavior disturbing. In addition to the death threat against his friend, Eric seemed unable to control his emotions. At the time, the internet was still a relatively new phenomenon, and it worried him that his son spent hours sitting in front of the computer. Things became even more complicated when on January 30th, 1998, Eric and Dylan were arrested for stealing electronic equipment from a van parked on the street. As minors, they were sentenced to community service and appeared remorseful before the judge and their parents. Eric's family decided to take him to a therapist to manage his anxiety, anger issues, and a diagnosed obsessive-compulsive disorder. Although he underwent treatment, agreed to take an antidepressant, and seemed resigned to his situation, deep down he was furious. He began to chronicle his plans for revenge in a journal. Dylan Bennett Klebold was born in Lakewood, Colorado on September 11, 1981. He was the son of Thomas Klebold and Susan Yasinoff, a close-knit but somewhat emotionally distant family, according to some neighbors. From a young age, Dylan demonstrated above-average intelligence and attended a school with a program for gifted students. However, he was not very sociable and struggled to fit in. Still, he formed a group of friends which included Brooks Brown and eventually Eric Harris. Dylan and Eric had several interests in common, such as music and video games, and began to spend a lot of time together. They entered Columbine High School in 1995, and it is here that the first contradictions in the case begin to emerge. Although journalist Dave Cullen, author of the 2009 book Columbine, asserts that Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold were not outcasts or victims of bullying, Brooks Brown, a friend and classmate of both, said in an interview that they were, in fact, the least popular students not just in their class, but in the entire school. Cullen's work, despite being praised by critics, has had several detractors on this and other points. For example, it is known that Eric was indeed picked on by certain students at the school. He was thin, of average height, and did not play any sports. In Dylan's case, Dave Cullen claims he was simply ignored. At 6'3", he was too tall for anyone to want to mess with him. However, Susan Klebold, Dylan's mother, asserts in her book A Mother's Reckoning that he was a victim of taunts and harassment from some classmates. Apparently, one day a group of students surrounded Dylan and Eric and doused them with ketchup while insinuating they were gay. The testimonies of several survivors from the library align on one point. Both shooters said they were going to kill everyone because of how they had been treated, which could confirm that in one way or another they did feel discriminated against or victimized. In addition to their interest in computers and video games, both attended audiovisual production classes and worked on a series of projects together. The pair's violent fantasies would be reflected in a film they shot in 1998 called Hitmen for Hire, in which they played two hitmen who wore black trench coats, the same attire they would don during the massacre. The idea of carrying out a mass murder at Columbine High School began to form after their arrest for stealing electronics in January 1998. The instigator of the massacre was reportedly Eric Harris. After the shooting, FBI investigators raided the killer's homes and collected hundreds of pieces of evidence, among them a manuscript by Eric Harris titled The Book of God. It revealed his delusions of grandeur and his desire to murder a large number of people in an act he described as revolutionary. He drew up blueprints of the school and decided on strategic locations for the attack, though he also fantasized about planting bombs in houses, on roads, bridges, and at gas stations. He also wrote, "It will be like the LA riots, the Oklahoma City bombing, World War II, Vietnam, Duke Nukem, and Doom all mixed together. I want to leave a lasting impression on the world." Another fragment of his writings reflects how frustrated and excluded he felt by his schoolmates. "I hate you people for leaving me out of so many fun things. You had my phone number and I asked and all, but no, don't let the weird-looking Eric kid come along." The profile that specialists drew up of Eric Harris was that of a megalomaniac with psychopathic traits, a liar and manipulator, devoid of empathy, and with an immense hatred for other people. Dylan Klebold, on the other hand, seemed very different. While some classmates described him as shy with a rather dark sense of humor, his writings were primarily depressive. He wrote love poems, drew hearts, and clearly seemed to be someone starved of affection. He hated himself and fantasized about suicide. One hypothesis suggests that Klebold joined the massacre devised by Harris solely as an excuse to take his own life. During the investigation, several videotapes were also found in which both young men showed off their arsenal and practiced with various firearms at makeshift shooting ranges. In late 1998, both Eric and Dylan were still minors, so they deceived an 18-year-old friend named Robin Anderson into accompanying them to a gun show to purchase weapons for them, claiming they would be used for hunting. Anderson would later state that she was completely unaware of their plans. In fact, she was Dylan's date to the senior prom on April 17, 1999, and said she noticed nothing unusual about him. But without a doubt, the most disturbing recordings were the so-called basement tapes, in which Eric and Dylan say goodbye to their loved ones and explain to the camera why they decided to carry out the massacre. These were confiscated by the FBI and eventually destroyed for fear they could be disseminated and influence the actions of other youths. Even so, transcripts of these recordings exist in which they fantasize about what they are about to do, how many fans they will get, how many future mass murderers they will inspire, and their desire for Spielberg or Tarantino to make a movie about them. Shortly before the attack, they had begun using the acronym NBK to refer to their planned massacre, an allusion to the film Natural Born Killers, of which they were avid fans. According to the writings found by the FBI, the date originally set for the attack was April 19th. There has been much speculation about this, as it seems they wanted it to coincide with the Waco siege and the Oklahoma City bombing, both of which also occurred on that date. While some sources say Harris decided to postpone it to get more ammunition, others claim they were waiting for a day when there would be more people in the school cafeteria. Another theory suggests the date was moved to April 20th because it was Adolf Hitler's birthday. Although Eric Harris drew several swastikas in his notebooks and showed some sympathy for the Ku Klux Klan, he never identified himself as a Nazi. On the other hand, it is unlikely that Dylan Klebold would have been drawn to this, given that his own family was of Jewish descent. On the day of the attack, Brooks Brown ran into Eric Harris shortly after 11 a.m. in the school parking lot and asked him why he hadn't been in class that morning. Despite their past problems, Eric replied, "Brooks, I like you now. It's about to get real in there. Get out of here. Go home." The boy left, unaware of what was about to happen. The final reports on the events at Columbine High School on April 20th, 1999, determined that Eric Harris murdered a total of 8 people and wounded 17 others. Dylan Klebold murdered 5 and wounded 4. 3 more were injured while trying to flee during the shooting. According to their respective diaries, the 2 young men had expected to kill a total of 500 students. Sometime later, a couple of photos would surface that are chilling in retrospect. In the official senior class photo, Eric and Dylan pose alongside their classmates, making threatening faces and pretending to aim guns at the camera. At that moment, they were already planning the massacre. The entire nation was horrified. The parents of Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold were held directly responsible for not noticing that their sons had serious mental health problems and were amassing a veritable arsenal right under their noses. Some conservative groups began to blame video games, and Doom became the center of the controversy due to its violent content. In the immediate aftermath, a blacklist was swiftly drawn up. Various musical acts, accused of promoting so-called anti-values, found their names on it. Rammstein, Prodigy, KMFDM, and most prominently Marilyn Manson. At the same time, the media spread the narrative that Eric and Dylan were part of a group called the Trenchcoat Mafia. In a telling phone call, Eric Harris's own father, upon learning of the shooting from television, dialed 911, suggesting his son could be responsible and was associated with this very group. The Trenchcoat Mafia was, in reality, a loose-knit clique of about a dozen students, often labeled as computer geeks and role-playing game enthusiasts. While Dylan and Eric knew some of its members who did in fact wear black trench coats, they were never part of the group. For Harris and Klebold, the trench coats served a more sinister purpose. A costume for their homemade Hitman-style videos and a way to conceal their arsenal on the day of the massacre. In time, the response from law enforcement also came under intense scrutiny. The slow pace of the police and SWAT teams during the attack drew heavy criticism. Some parents of the survivors insisted their children saved themselves, claiming that no one dared to enter the building while the attackers were still active inside. The death of teacher William Dave Sanders became a focal point of this controversy. He bled to death for hours, long after the killers had committed treason. Had the SWAT team entered sooner, his life might have been saved. But perhaps the most enduring controversy was the sheer ease with which two teenagers acquired a veritable arsenal. Gun control in the United States had been a fiercely debated topic for decades. And while Columbine seemed to be a tipping point, the measures taken in its wake were, to many, bewildering. Instead of tightening laws for firearm acquisition or improving mental health systems for young people, the response was to recruit armed police officers into nearly half of the nation's public schools, install metal detectors, and even provide teachers with bulletproof whiteboards. School shootings in the United States are a horrifying reality, and despite the devastating consequences, it seems little has been learned. The right to bear arms is enshrined in the Constitution of a country that is home to the highest number of mass murders. It's a sobering fact that Americans, who make up less than 5% of the global population, own 48% of the world's 650 million civilian-held firearms. Another alarming statistic reveals that while the U.S. has less than 5% of the world's people, it suffers from 31% of its mass shootings. This brings to mind a phrase coined in 1885 by Alexandre Lacassagne. Societies have the criminals they deserve. It is a statement that compels reflection. For if a society breeds this type of killer, it must also bear the responsibility for an even longer list of victims. Columbine was not the first school shooting to shake the United States. Looking only at the latter half of the 1990s paints a grim picture. In February 1996, a 14-year-old in Washington murdered his teacher and two classmates. In January 1997, a 16-year-old in Alaska killed his school principal and a student. In October 1997, a 16-year-old in Mississippi stabbed his mother to death before going to his school, where he killed two students and wounded 7 more. In December 1997, a 14-year-old in Kentucky opened fire, killing 3 students and injuring 5. In March 1998, an 11-year-old and a 13-year-old in Arkansas ambushed their middle school, killing 4 students and a teacher. And in May 1998, a 15-year-old in Oregon murdered his parents before driving to his high school, where he killed 2 students and wounded 25 others. Yet despite this history of violence, the Columbine massacre remains one of the most traumatic events in the nation's collective memory. It marked a definitive before and after for American society. Never before had a school shooting received such intense international media coverage. To this day, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold are perversely remembered as martyrs by a generation of outcasts who have chosen to follow in their footsteps. Seung-Hui Cho, the perpetrator of the 2007 Virginia Tech massacre, where 32 people lost their lives, recorded videos declaring his admiration for the Columbine killers. Adam Lanza, the 20-year-old who murdered 20 children and 6 adults at Sandy Hook Elementary, was also reportedly obsessed with them. The 2018 Kerch Polytechnic College massacre in Crimea, which left 21 dead and 67 injured, also appears to have been inspired by Columbine. The attacker wore clothing strikingly similar to Eric Harris's. The chilling influence even reached Mexico. On January 10, 2020, an 11-year-old boy shot and killed a teacher and wounded 6 classmates before committing suicide. He was wearing military-style pants, suspenders, and a white t-shirt emblazoned with the words "Natural Selection," an exact replica of the shirt Eric Harris wore. Natural selection was a recurring phrase in Harris's journals, a reference to the survival of the fittest. This suggests he saw himself as superior, with the right to assume the role of an executioner, to punish society regardless of the consequences. The body of literature and film related to the Columbine case is vast. However, one of the most essential works is Michael Moore's documentary, Bowling for Columbine. In it, Moore offers a searing critique of American culture and its relationship with firearms. He also interviews the musician Marilyn Manson, who was scapegoated by numerous groups as a primary cause of the massacre. In response, Manson offered a sharp rebuttal. The two byproducts of that whole tragedy were violence in entertainment and gun control. We forgot about Monica Lewinsky and we forgot about the president shooting bombs overseas, yet I'm a bad guy because I sing some rock and roll songs. Who's a bigger influence, the president or Marilyn Manson? I'd like to think me, but I'm going to go with the president. At one point, Moore asks Manson what he would say to Eric and Dylan if he could speak to them. Manson's reply was profound. I wouldn't say a single word to them, he said. I would listen to what they have to say, and that's what no one did.